All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Charlie. I'm an adult services librarian at the North Beach branch. I'm just going to get us started off here really quickly with a couple quick notes. We are experiencing some extreme weather in San Francisco right now, so I'm hoping, fingers crossed, no sort of technical issues happen on our end. But if they do, we will just try to get the Zoom back up and running. You should be able to use the same link to rejoin if there's a blip on our end. The program will also be recorded, so if you can't stay for the whole time, or you know someone else who registered and they aren't able to make it, they can still view the recording. We'll be able to email that to them. I also wanted to say our San Francisco land acknowledgement. The San Francisco Public Library acknowledges that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. October at North Beach, we have a couple really exciting programs going on. It's going to be Italian Heritage Month. We also have a Queer History Month walking tour that'll be on Sunday, the 6th. We have some writing workshops, and we also have a cooking workshop. These are all things that you can go check out on sfpl.org/events and look at the North Beach location. I'll also try to populate them in the chat. And then we have our author, Professor Coyote expert tonight. Stanley D. Gehrt is a professor of wildlife ecology and wildlife extension specialist at Ohio State University. He's the author of Coyotes Among Us and is the principal investigator of the Urban Coyote Research Project. He is regarded as an international expert of urban wildlife, and his research has been featured in numerous print, radio, and television outlets. His research interests focus on various aspects of mammalian ecology, especially in urban systems and dynamics of wildlife disease. Without further ado, I'll stop my screen share and let Dr. Stan take it away. Thank you.
All right, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. Let me see. Am I sharing that screen? Can you see that? Let me see. Um, I'm sorry, let me get this. Okay, is that hopefully that is the slideshow is visible. Hopefully we're screen sharing. There's the chat. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, hopefully that will be the only delay. Let me get this off of my screen. As I said, thank you very much for inviting me here and sharing part of this evening with you. So as mentioned, I've been studying coyotes over in the Chicago area for a number of years. That has resulted in a book that we produced this year where we tried to summarize everything that we know so far and produce a book that hopefully is readable and informative as well as entertaining to the general public. And so that's Coyotes Among Us, Secrets of the City's Top Predator. It summarizes this research that we've been doing in Chicago. So I've been very fortunate to be the principal investigator of this long-running project. We began in the year 2000, and it's still continuing today. So we're in our 24th year. So this book summarizes the 23 years and some of the things that we've learned. And I'll be sharing some of that with you today or tonight. And Some of it, most of it, is going to be very applicable to San Francisco. Fortunately, our research isn't the only project that's being conducted in different cities. Now there's been other projects that have basically spun off of ours. And we currently have urban studies of coyotes in Atlanta, Georgia, Minneapolis, Denver was done not too long ago. And of course, LA has had a long running project over there, among others. And so what is exciting is that we're beginning to see consistencies across these cities. And so as I share with you some of the things that we've learned about our Chicago coyotes, I'll point out things that are similar across cities, and so they're very applicable to San Francisco. But then there's also some really interesting differences that are beginning to appear, and I'll point that out. There aren't many, but there are some that are kind of interesting and possibly pretty important. So this is the cover of the book. I'll just point out that, again, this project, because of it's been going on for so long, we've radio collared and tracked many hundreds of coyotes among 9 million people, and it's received a lot of attention. And in fact, it's got an international reputation. This is a screenshot, or not a screenshot, this is a picture of one of our animals. This is 1288. And I'll just point out the book has a number of excellent photographs in it. In fact, that was one of our goals. And many of them were taken by Corey Arnold, who is an excellent wildlife photographer for National Geographic. In fact, they were used in a story for National Geographic. And so I'll use some of those images to kind of illustrate and make certain points along the way. So we'll come back to 1288 a little bit later. I'll tell you his story. And in fact, the goal of the book is to share coyote stories with the public. We owe it to the animals that we've captured in radio collared. We would only do that if we're going to learn from them. And then, of course, we have an obligation to share what we learn to the public. A lot of our funding is publicly funded. So 1288 is a young male, and he became an international sensation. So here are some National Geographic issues from 3 different countries, and he made the cover of those different countries, and it just gives you an idea of the impact this research project has had over the years. And in fact, there's a recent, I should have actually included this in the presentation. There's a current series available from the BBC that's now available here over in the US on mammals. It's the largest, it's a revisit of a large series of documentaries focused on mammals. One of the episodes is focused on nighttime mammals, and it turns out that our Chicago coyotes, they came over to Chicago to film our animals, and so they actually make an appearance for about 5 minutes or so in that episode. So just another example, again, with the international impact that this is having. This is a picture of Corey Arnold doing his thing. So he's setting up these cameras, and this will be the last time I'll talk about the photography. But again, we were blessed to have him, as well as a few other photographers come and devote their time to the project. Again, they're benefiting from it as well. Again, trying to tell these coyote stories. So here he's setting up a camera array with strobes and everything. Again, this is National Geographic quality, and this is the image that he got coming through that fence. So we'll see a few more of his images a little bit later. I wanted to point out, we make this point in the book, is that coyotes definitely have a tough PR thing going on, and it started a long time ago. In fact, Mark Twain is probably the single most important influence in terms of how people view coyotes or misinterpret coyotes. And this came from his writing early on in the mid 1800s, when he saw his very first coyote, and he wrote an essay about it, and it was not a flattering essay. A little taste of what he wrote for the coyote is represented here. So he wrote that the coyote is a long, slim, sick, and sorry-looking skeleton that is a living, breathing allegory of want. He is always hungry, and that's probably the best thing he said about him. The reason why that's important isn't because a lot of people read Twain, it's because Chuck Jones used Mark Twain's description of coyotes as an inspiration for the Coyote and the Roadrunner cartoons. And that cartoon series has had as much of an impact, I believe, on the public's perception of these animals as anything, in addition to the times when they do come into conflict with us. So it's unfortunate because that isn't even close to what these animals actually look like or behave like or function out in the environment. They're important animals. They do important things, even in the cities, and I'll illustrate some of that here in just a second. I do want to point out that for us over in the eastern part of the US, the coyote is not native. They expanded their range from this historic range at the time of pre-European colonialization to now they dominate North America. And in fact, they've recently, in the last few years, crossed the Panama Canal. So time will tell whether or not they're able to expand to a new continent. But just the idea that an animal is expanding its range and moving, expanding across one continent and actually beginning to colonize a separate continent on its own, definitely not with our help, and in fact, with our persecution, in the face of our persecution, is a pretty amazing quality, something for us to keep in mind when we ask the question, why do we have to live with coyotes? One of the reasons why they've been so successful is that they are highly adaptable and they they have a wide dietary niche. They also have a wide niche as far as the types of habitat that they can use. And many other aspects of their behavior and their ecology is very adaptable. For example, they're the perfect size energetically to be able to live off of very small prey or very large prey. So if they were larger, if they were, say, wolf size, they would be constrained from being able to live over the long term on very small animals like this vole, which happens to be the coyote's favorite food in most of the systems where it lives. But they can also expand to the large prey. And this is a pair of alpha animals over in Chicago that killed a perfectly healthy doe. They were able to do this because they're on lake ice. So this is during the winter when the lakes freeze over, and they will push the deer out onto the ice, which then becomes an equalizer, and they're able to take the deer. So, and in fact, I've also done research on coyotes over in Nova Scotia, where we were able to document that they, under certain circumstances, and they're very specific circumstances, but they're able to actually hunt and at times kill moose, which are the moose there on Cape Breton Island are about 750 to 800 pounds. So that's quite a range in size, from voles all the way up to the large ungulates. And this is a test. I don't know if this is going to play or not for you all. This is a video. It's just an illustration that even though it's fascinating to think of them consuming large prey, they're really good at hunting small prey. So, and this is one of our Chicago animals, mousing, and that was a vole that it caught underneath the snow. Hopefully you were able to see that. So they're really good at hunting and consuming small prey like rodents and rabbits, and we will come back to that a little bit later because we'll see just how often they do that here in the city. But the most recent habitat that they've conquered would be the cities. So basically all major metropolitan areas across North America, or at least in the US and Canada, have resident coyote populations. That wasn't always the case. It wasn't the case in Chicago. This is our Chicago skyline. They were not there decades ago. They began making their appearance in the late 70s and 1980s. They really became established in the late 1990s, and then they took off. Very similar pattern to other cities. And so it just so happened that I came to Chicago as a research biologist, studying a variety of different urban wildlife, and I was asked to do a very short study on coyotes in the Chicago area because they were beginning to appear for the first time in areas where they'd never been seen before, and the management agencies did not know what to do about that. Is that something to be concerned about? The public was definitely asking questions, and they needed good, unbiased data with which to make management decisions. And so that was the goal. And originally it was going to be a 1-year study. So this is back in 2000. And right away, within the first animal, the very first animal we ever radio collared, I realized that all of our assumptions about coyotes in urban areas, which again, at that time was not a common phenomenon. It was rare, and we didn't know much about it. Well, all of our assumptions were wrong. So basically, we had to start fresh. And it turns out that we needed to conduct more research, and it grew from there and just hasn't stopped. So now we've been going on for a long enough period, and we've been able to explore a wide range of questions. So the very first series of questions involved population dynamics, their space use, like where do they go, especially in relation to people and our pets. Disease dynamics is actually helping to fund the project. So we're always looking at diseases, and that's another way that coyotes could potentially impact either ourselves or our domestic animals. Their diet, that's been an important question throughout the study, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. And then their social structure, that's one that we've built onto. Their ecological role refers to what kind of impacts do they have on the urban wildlife? Do they have any at all, or are they just consuming garbage? The population genetics is something we're focused on currently, as well as a thing called behavioral syndromes, which is another term for personalities. And so that's our current focus at the moment, is we're trying to measure the genetic aspects to their behavior to see whether or not urban areas, cities, may be selecting for a certain kind of coyote that behaves in a certain way. So do we do this research? We radio collar these animals. That's what we've done from the very beginning with our very first coyote number 1. So it's a live trapping study. We collect samples from them. So we collect hair, whiskers are what we use for diet analysis. We, of course, collect blood either for disease or genetic analyses, as well as fecal samples. We measure them, we weigh them. This is a picture of an animal actually recaptured in a trap. And when we capture them, we take them back to the lab. Then we take our measurements and our samples from our animals. And just a few pictures of some animals being processed. We always look at their physical condition. That's obviously a big question. Are urban coyotes healthy, or are they unhealthy? And in general, I can say that our coyotes, and I'm sure San Francisco coyotes on average, are extremely healthy because it's a pretty, I guess, favorable environment for coyotes in the city for the most part. So teeth are a really important part of their body, which we record those as well. That's another record of their teeth. And this is an animal that's about to be taken back and released. So we take them back to the place where we capture them. So we're not translocating them anywhere. We're always taking them back as quickly as we can. back to the site that we captured them. And then we radio track them and we try to follow them as long as we can and document their lives and then tell their stories. In addition to the adults and the trapping, we also go into the dens each spring and we attempt to find their dens, and then we for one time, for one day, we will go in and we will collect the pups. We'll microchip them so they're permanently marked, same microchips that you would use for your pets, your cats and your dogs. And we will draw either a tiny bit of blood or hair for genetic analysis, which I'll come back to. So this is a picture of one of our dens, and this looks like a very natural landscape, not really very urban, until you turn the camera to the side, and you can see that that den is actually located in a subdivision. And this is actually one of the interesting things about coyotes is their goal is to reproduce, and they only produce one litter a year. This scenario right here is one of the most stressful times for a coyote during the 6 weeks that they have pups in or around a den. That's the only time that they're fixed to a particular point or a particular spot, and that they're extremely good parents. And so this can form the basis for some conflicts, especially with dogs occasionally. Just some pictures of pups because they're cute, getting measured. There's a 4-week-old pup that at that age, they're very easy to handle. This is a little older, and I'm sorry, that's some of our dogs. This is a pup that's getting blood, a tiny bit of blood collected. Another pup about to be put back into the den. So we've actually captured and marked over the 20 plus years, a little over 1,500 coyotes. Actually, I believe we're at about 1,580 coyotes that we've captured and marked. And of those, we've radio collared over 700 individuals. We also marked over 600 pups from that sample. Now there's overlap there because some animals graduate to a size to be able to radio collar. And you'll notice that at the bottom, we've also captured 2 dogs and 2 people. Those were in the early years when we were still figuring out how to do this work. So overall, over a 23-year period or 24-year period, it's a pretty good record. We haven't had many conflicts with our research. So a couple big things that we need to get established is that all coyote populations, whether they're urban or rural, or whether they occur in San Francisco or in Chicago, they all are comprised of 3 different kinds of coyotes. So you have your resident animals that are territorial, so they maintain these exclusive territories. We have transients that are non-territorial. They have these large overlapping areas, and we have dispersers that are only here temporarily and will be gone within the day or within a few days. And I'll give you some examples of each of these. And it's important because they represent different levels of potential conflict or coexistence. So the residents make up the foundation of the population. And those are your coyote packs. And coyotes do live in groups, even though you rarely see them living in a group. That's because they spend most of their time foraging either alone or in pairs. But we have found that our coyote pack sizes can range anywhere from 2 to 8 individuals. Their territory sizes are relatively small in the urban setting, so a little bit less than 2 square miles. That's very small for coyote territories. But the solitary home ranges average about 15 square miles, and some of them can even maintain these solitary home ranges over 200 square miles. So just to show you what that looks like, here's Coyote 466, a really uniquely patterned animal that we will come back to him a little bit later. He's hiding in the grass. He was an alpha male, a breeding male, and here is his territory. And he lived in a large nature preserve or a large natural park, if you will. And you see red and yellow dots there. Those are his GPS locations. He was getting located by satellites, so we have a lot of locations for him over the span of about a 9-month period. And so you can see what his territory looked like during that period. So he owned that nature preserve, or at least the north section. And then another pack lived in the south section. You can see that there's a hard edge to those territories. In this case, it's the road that's forming the marker for the edge, but that's not because the animal can't cross the road. He can. In fact, you'll see a few dots across the road. It's just that their social structure is so strong that the hard edges are created by adjoining coyote territories. And you just have a quilt-like pattern of these territories across the large metropolitan area. So this is a nature preserve, and this is a preserve that we've done a lot of work in. This is in one particular year. Each one of these colored dots represent the radiolocations of an alpha animal for that pack. So each color represents a different pack, and the dots represent the locations of that alpha animal. And so you're going to be seeing a few other maps like this, so I want to make sure that you understand what these actually represent. So in this case, we're looking at 6 packs, all living in this one urban park. It's one of the highest densities that's been recorded for coyotes. This is a very small, I mean, it's a large park, but the territories are very, very small. But hopefully you can see just again that hard edge to the territory. So they're highly territorial, they're very structured, they maintain those territories year after year after year. And in fact, if they're lucky, I guess their offspring sometimes will inherit that territory if their parents die. And so then they'll maintain the same boundaries, or even an unrelated animal can come in if something happens to the alpha animals, and they can assume that territory. So highly structured, and that's in a park, but we also see the same pattern occurring out in the urban matrix. So without the benefit of any park or any large park, these coyotes are still able to maintain these exclusive territories. They look a little different because now they have to avoid us. So you're going to see very patchy distributions to their locations. But what you will also see is that they're not overlapping with each other. So they're maintaining the very, very structured system. And so these people, this is one of the suburban cities. This is Schaumburg, about 90,000 people in this slide. And they're all living with multiple packs of coyotes. And if we blow the image out even further, in fact, O'Hare, the airport, is located over in the lower right-hand corner down here. So all of these polygons represent the resident territories of groups of coyotes living in different parts of that landscape. Those are the residents. And then we have the solitary transients. The transients are loners that have left their packs, are now floating across that landscape, but they're still staying within the Chicago region. So in fact, they're still overlapping in many cases with their natal range, with the pack that they were born from, but they can't stay there. So coyotes are very picky, and only the alpha pair will mate. So once their offspring get to a certain age, and if they start to become sexually mature, they are excluded from the territory, and then they become solitary. These transients, there's relatively little research has been done on them historically because they're hard to study. But what we're finding is that they're really important to understanding the dynamics of the population locally. And they're one of the big reasons why if you attempt to remove coyotes from an area, let's say you do, it's only going to be a temporary situation because they will be replaced by other coyotes. And this is one of the big reasons why. It's because of these solitary transients. They quickly fill the void. They're just floating around looking for a vacancy. So when you create that vacancy, they fill it almost immediately. And I don't know if you can see this video clip, but this is one of our these animals living out in the urban matrix have to become nocturnal. So this is one of the adjustments that they make. So when they're sharing space with us, they have to restrict their activity to the nighttime to avoid us. And so this is one of our animals, 571, cruising around at night in the neighborhoods, but trying to avoid people as much as possible. And here in this case, she's getting a meal, which happens to be cat food, and you see the cat in the window watching the coyote eat its food. But the homeowner, in all likelihood, doesn't know that there's a coyote living there, and that's because they're so good at hiding from people. So in this case, you have a couple of people walking down the sidewalk. She sees them, and then she finds a way to avoid them, and they never saw her. So one of the ways that coyotes make adjustments to try to live with us and avoid us at the same time. A pretty tricky task. So these territories aren't defended from other coyotes. They're mainly defended indirectly through scent marking or through howling. So howling bouts are very important for that, and very rarely through attacks. And so we rarely document injuries caused by coyotes attacking each other. This is a big difference between coyotes and wolves, for example. Wolves have a similar social structure and spatial pattern. They also maintain territories as packs, only much larger packs, but they kill each other. So far, we've never documented coyotes killing each other in this population, even though the densities are have now reached very high levels. And this is just a picture from the book. We were able to get Debbie DiCarlo to let us use her image that she was able to get. This is a real image. It's not stuffed animals. And it just kind of shows how important howling and communication is among the coyotes in their groups. These howling bouts, so the adults are showing and teach the pups how to do this. They serve two functions. One is to advertise to the adjacent packs that this territory is occupied. And then also it's to facilitate the family bonds, to keep the bonding going on within the groups, because they do spend a lot of time foraging individually, but they come together at rendezvous sites, and there's a lot of howling going on and happiness and sniffing and licking and all that good stuff. We did actually do some research early on. I had a PhD student that actually tested the idea, can coyotes actually count how many coyotes are participating in a howling bout? And I won't go into the details because it's not really relevant to, to what we're talking about tonight. But what she found, this was Karen Hallberg. She went around the country recording howling bouts with captive coyotes so she could count how many animals were actually on that recording. And then she would go into the territories of our radio collared animals and play the playbacks and then watch the response. And what we found was that they definitely responded differently depending on the size of that group on that recording. So it does communicate a lot of information to other animals. In terms of reproduction, this is actually kind of important because this can be a source of some of the conflicts, and also is another reason why it's hard to eliminate coyotes from any area. So on one hand, you have solitary animals moving in, immediately replacing removed individuals, but then you also have coyotes being, again, extremely adaptive, and they can increase their reproductive rate when they are getting persecuted pretty heavily. So as I mentioned, they have a single litter a year. What we found, we tested the idea of monogamy. So again, monogamy is the breeding system or the mating system that's common for canids. So that would be for wolves, coyotes, foxes, and jackals, not dogs. Dogs are not monogamous at all. But usually there's been a few genetic studies of wolves and foxes, and what they have found when they've genetically tested the litters, they found cheating happening quite a bit. We actually tested this, and we thought that there would be a lot of cheating going on in our population. So we thought that there would be behavioral monogamy, but a lot of genetic cheating. But what we found was the opposite. So um, over a 17-year period, we genotyped almost 900 animals, including from that sample about 312 pups from 68 litters. And what we found was no evidence of extra pair mating. And the longest mate pair was 10 years. So not only are these animals monogamous within a year, but they stay monogamous throughout their life. So until the death of one of their mates, they stay together. So pretty strong monogamy. This is also, in some cases, something that leads to conflicts every once in a while because both the male and female are very attentive to the litter and to the den and to the raising of the offspring, and they can be very protective of that litter. And that happens to be a picture of one of our alpha pairs tied together, just like dogs. If you've ever seen dogs actually copulate. This is one of the pictures from Corey Arnold. This is one of our alpha pairs, and it turns out that these alpha pairs, again, very strong bond. They travel together quite a bit, but a lot of times you'll only see one of them, and the second one is nearby, but it's usually harder to see. And so this is an example of that. So again, a radio collared pair, they were together for about 4 years until one of them died. And you can see one of them pretty easily and the other one's in the background. But they're always together, or I should say they're very often together year round, even though they're only mating for a very brief period in the late winter or early spring. I think California, you have a little earlier mating season than we do. So you start sometimes in January and early February. We peak coincidentally with February 14th. That is literally the peak date of mating in our animals in Chicago. So it sounds like a bad joke, but it's the truth, I guess. So the reason why I point this out is that these are the animals that are defending these territories. And usually when you do have a conflict, if you do have a coyote that's acting aggressive, and especially aggressive toward dogs, it's often a member of the alpha pair. And most often it's the male, but it doesn't have to be just the male. What's the advantage to monogamy? Well, one of the advantages is that, again, being monogamous means that the male has to help raise the young because those are his only young. So he's just as invested in those young animals as the female is. And when she has help, then in addition to the male, I mean, all their subordinates, if they're young offspring from the previous year, if they're also present, they will also help raise the litter. That allows the female to max out on the litter size and still successfully raise the offspring. So this is a litter coming from a single pair, and that's 11 pups. And that's typically, we see large litter sizes in our urban animals compared to rural animals. This is partly due to the abundance of resources. So food is very abundant in the city or in suburban areas, and this is reflected in larger litters and high pup survival. So I just want to tell a couple stories real quick with some of the animals that we've been tracking. So this is coyote number 1. So obviously she was a special animal because she started the project off. And I was able to convince the publishers to sneak in one quick little picture of her in the book. She deserved to have a whole page just to herself, but we didn't have an image good enough for the publishers. but I forced them to put one picture of her in there because she was so important. So we caught her that first month, March of 2000. That's the picture to the left. She was a yearling or about to turn a year old at that point. She was on her own. She was a transient at that stage, but she, in the next year, became a resident. She found her territory and her mate. And the picture down below is her as a prime reproducing female. That's in February of 2004. So that's 4 years later. She's actually pregnant in that picture where we're holding her. And then the picture to the right is actually her mate, Coyote 115. So Coyote number 1 and Coyote 115, they hooked up. They actually got together in 2002, and then they stayed together for a decade until she finally passed away. And then he took on a new mate, but they were together for 10 years. And where they lived is kind of important, an important part of their story. By the way, so this is me recapturing her as a 12-year-old coyote. This is or as an 11-year-old coyote, about to become 12. And I had to recapture her to replace her radio collar. And I won't tell you the story behind that, but she's not immobilized there. So I had to jump on her and grab her because she knew how to get out of traps. And I had to duct tape her mouth shut so that she wouldn't bite me. And then we eventually got her back to the lab. So that was the last year that we were able to radio track her. It was just an amazing feeling. We had been following her for over 10 years. And just to be able to, I mean, see this animal and to touch this animal that you had spent a large part of your career with was kind of a special thing. And this is a more dignified picture of her without the duct tape around her mouth. So that's an old coyote. It's rare to see any coyote that's over 10 years old. And this is an 11 plus. This is coyote heading toward 12. What an amazing animal. And then again, this is her mate, and he actually outlived her. Also another amazing animal. And we were never able to recapture him. We were just very lucky that the batteries lived or had a long lifespan. Here's where they live. So these are the radio locations for Coyote 1. And this is one of those suburban animals that did not have a large forest preserve or a large nature area to live in. So they're living off of golf courses, little parks, and going through neighborhoods at night. And she did that for over a decade, living in this community. And the purple dots are melon heads or Coyote 115. And so you can see that this is the last year of her life. So that was 2012, I believe. And so that was where they lived. And it's important to point out that they basically lived their whole life within a few yards of people without any conflicts. And after she died, this is just the same map kind of blown out. This is where they're located or were located after she passed away. Coyote 115 moved to the west, and these are his locations after her death. And he set up a new territory. This is out behind a Walmart, a super Walmart. And he lived the last 2 years of his life in this community. Again, only just a few yards away from people his whole life. They had at least 8 litters together, I should say 7 litters together, and almost 90 pups that they produced during that time. And this is his last image, so as a 12-year-old coyote. So now I just want to touch on real quick. We have moved downtown into the most urban part of the Chicago landscape. This is in the last 9 to 10 years we've done this. And we're trying to learn the most extreme urban ecology of these animals because we didn't believe that coyotes could actually successfully live in, let's say, inside the city of Chicago, especially down toward the center, the core, what is what we call it. So here are some of these locations. I'll zoom in so you can see them. Hopefully you can see these. If you're familiar with Chicago, this is Navy Pier. So this is downtown. Each one of these colors, again, represents a different pack, a different territory. And the locations represent the locations of an alpha animal. So you'll notice that they are maintaining exclusive areas, just like we were saying before. Only now, if you look at their movement patterns, now you see these really long linear movements. And this is what happens as you move in toward the city. When you get into the extreme downtown areas where you do not have green spaces, or at least very few green spaces available to them, they have to use our linear corridors, both to travel in as well as to hunt in and to rest in. So here's some of Corey Arnold's excellent pictures of some of our animals at night. This is railroad tracks going over what would be typically a busy road during the day. And this is one of our Coyotes 1180. He is using that as a travel corridor. Same coyote, also on a railroad uh, line. So the railways, either active railways or inactive railways, are important habitats for these coyotes in the city. Again, both for traveling as well as for hunting, because there is food along the railways as well as the interstates and the large thoroughfares. So here's just a close view of some of these territories of these alpha animals in these different packs. This is on the south side of Chicago. So this will be Lake Michigan over here, and this is Lakeshore Drive. And again, you can see just how linear their movement patterns are. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that basically coyotes are capable of living in any parts of the city, which means that people, no matter where you are living in a city, there's a good chance that you are sharing space with the coyote. You may not know it, you may not see them there, but they can figure out how to exploit that environment. And definitely San Francisco is a city. You've had coyotes in your community for a lot longer period than we have had over in Chicago. So I have no doubt that you've got a resident population doing the exact same thing as these guys are. And every other urban study of coyotes have been showing the same patterns. So this is a very consistent pattern of space use across different cities. This is 748. So I'll just point out him. He's an interesting story. And he also has a picture in the book. So this is on Lakeshore Drive. He was the alpha male. And these are his radio locations. And there's a cluster of locations over here. I don't know if you can see this, my pointer, but that is Soldier Field, where the Bears play. This cluster of locations represents their den site where they raised a litter, like right across the road from Soldier Field. So this is 748. This is a picture I took actually when I was trying to figure out what was going on here. This is on the top level of a parking deck across the street from the stadium, and they actually were able to find a way to have a litter and raise a litter on that parking deck. You'll see trees here. Those trees, that's green architecture taking place. So there's a double layer of concrete with soil there. They planted trees to try and reduce the amount of asphalt or reflection. And it turns out that that also provides an opportunity for coyotes to have a den. This is 1288 again. This is on the Chicago River, and I just want to point out, this is an image from the book. Well, I should say, I don't know if you can see this, but there's a sign up here saying no trespassing beyond this point. That is a good time for me, a reminder for me to point out that there are nooks and crannies, even in the most urbanized parts of the city, that you don't really pay any attention to. You probably pass and you may not even see it. Well, there can be a small little green space in there, and especially in areas that are designated no trespassing, that provides an opportunity for coyotes to have hiding places or small foraging areas as well. I don't have time to go into how coyotes are crossing roads. We have been able to document that they do learn traffic patterns, the resident animals do. And unfortunately, even though they are very good at crossing roads, many of them eventually make a mistake. And it turns out that this is the largest threat to them, and the most common cause of mortality is getting hit by cars. And that's also a pattern that has been repeated across cities, across studies, across the board. This is our most urban animal. So these are the yellow locations of a coyote, 447. She was a fascinating animal, one of our first downtown animals we radio collared. So these are her GPS locations. This is Navy Pier. These are skyscrapers. And she would go through there. We would not, just like your car, if you're driving through um, these big skyscrapers, you lose satellite reception. Same thing is true with their radio collars. So she had a GPS collar, and we would lose satellite reception for her while she was moving among the skyscrapers, and then she would come out. So it turns out that that territory that she maintained, I say that she was the most urban animal. That's because the human population living within her territory, we estimated to be over 700,000 people. So almost 750,000 people living inside one coyote territory is a pretty fascinating and amazing feature to that urban coyote ecology. And I'm going to skip these. These are actually videos of coyotes crossing roads. I'm going to skip those for now. I think, well, here's a quick video if you can see it. You see a cyclist pass by. This is at night. This is 447. She's actually standing on the sidewalk waiting for the street lights to turn to stop the traffic so that she can easily cross the road. And again, she was very good at that. She knew which streets had street lights, which ones did not, and she would change the way that she would move across the streets depending on those features of those roads. And you'll see people in the background. I can tell you, we followed her. None of those people ever saw her. So this is what happens when you feed coyotes. So most of the coyotes are getting natural foods, but some of them are taking human foods. And if they get human foods in a predictable way, such as people intentionally feeding them and leaving food out on a regular basis, they will greatly restrict their locations, because if they don't have to cross roads, they're not going to do it, because that's dangerous. So these are the radio locations of another animal with a GPS collar. This is 750, one of my favorite animals. That's me holding him. I caught him in a cemetery. He's the second largest coyote that we've caught in the study. So he was 40, almost 45 pounds. So that's for us, that's a huge coyote. And we put this fancy GPS collar on him, a very expensive collar, so that we were hoping that we would get these amazing movements going through the city. And it turns out that he spent the whole life of the collar, which is over a year, never taking a step outside of the cemetery that he was caught in. And in fact, he ended up living there for almost 5 years until he disappeared and probably died. He was getting fed by people, and I'll show you that in just a little bit. And real quick, coming back to 1288, remember this is the coyote that I showed you in the beginning. This is actually on the Chicago River, right across the river from the Sears Tower. So this is highly urban. He's a good example of a transient, and what happens. Actually, an animal that started off as a resident is born and raised in a group, in a territorial pack, and then leaving, becoming a transient. So how did he arrive at this location? Like how did he get across the river from Sears Tower? Well, here's what happened. So this is a map of his locations. This would be downtown Chicago. That's Navy Pier. So we're up quite a ways in terms of distance, but this is completely developed. This is the downtown Chicago. This cluster of locations over here in this circle are his locations while he was a young yearling male, still with his family, still with his parents and his siblings. They lived in a cemetery. This is Grayson Cemetery. He then had to leave because he was becoming sexually mature. So he moved to the north. You'll see a cluster of locations up there. That was another cemetery. That's actually where 750 used to live. There was already a pack of coyotes living there. So he couldn't stay. He had to move. So he moved to the west. These are his locations, these red dots to the west. Then he moved to the south, a major movement to the south. So that's about 19 miles. And then he moved back in toward the city and eventually to the Chicago River and across the river from Sears Tower. So he was a transient. And it's just a good illustration of, he was just one animal, but he represents about 30% of the coyote population in the Chicago region. About somewhere between 25 to 30% of the population are these transients. And it's a good example of how it doesn't matter where in the city you remove coyotes, potentially they're going to be replaced by a transient because they're able to make their way through any part of that landscape. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I'll just mention this is a slide of something that we published a few years ago on the diets of these animals. Now, I don't have time to go into this. So we do collect a whisker from our animals and we use a process called stable isotope analysis to actually look at the composition of their diet during the growth of that whisker. And it's a very successful technique, a very effective technique at identifying how much of that animal's diet is human-based foods, such as our foods or our pet food, or other kinds of garbage related to us, versus their natural prey. And I don't have time to explain this graph necessarily, but what we found when we analyze this for all of these animals is that the majority of them are still eating natural foods. So they're still functioning like predators or scavengers and performing presumably some ecological functions in the city. But there are some that are eating human foods. And so again, without going into a lot of detail, I'll just say each one of these black dots represents an individual coyote from whom we collected a whisker. We analyzed the whisker, and the animals that are on the right-hand side of this red dotted or dashed line, these are all coyotes that have some degree of human food in their diet. All the other coyotes, which is the majority of the coyotes, are on the left-hand side. These are animals that are eating natural prey. The ones that are over here in this yellow section, those are the ones that are taking over 75% of their diet is human-based. So these are the ones that are either getting fed intentionally by people or they're finding a predictable source of human food. And you can see that's a small percentage of the overall population. So a small percentage is getting fed by people, and that contributes to conflicts, but the majority are not. I don't have time to do this real quick. I'll just tell you that some of these animals are predictable and some were surprising in terms of their diet. So I showed you this one, 750, living in this cemetery. I said that this animal was getting fed by people. Well, this is 750, I'm sorry, it's 740. So 740 living in the cemetery, this is kibble. So where the animal ends up, this red dot, is what their diet is primarily based on. And so this is dog food. So he was eating almost exclusively dog food. And that's why he could live in a very, very small area. He was also an exception in that he was getting fed on a daily basis by people visiting the cemetery who had basically adopted him. And he actually did not lose his fear of people for some reason. He was one of the most shy coyotes you'll ever see, and yet he was getting fed by people every day. Most of the time, that does not happen. And then I mentioned 748 here earlier, the one that was raising the litter near Soldier Field. He was surprising, just an example of an animal that, I'm sorry, he is located over here on the far left-hand side, on the left-hand side of that red line, over by rabbits. And in fact, that's the only food we ever saw him eating, was that he would actually hunt rabbits on Lakeshore Drive. And it turns out, a lot of people don't realize is that, at least in the Midwestern cities, the rabbit densities become quite high. And coyotes are actually an important predator for them. So so those are some of the ecological aspects. Real quick in terms of conflicts, through 2022, I haven't updated it yet, but of all of the animals that we've marked and all of the animals that we followed, only 4% of those animals ever generated complaints by people. And even of the animals that generated the complaints, many of them were just centered more on the animal being seen in an area that made the people uncomfortable. Very few of them actually were aggressive or were involved in any other kind of more extreme attack. So that's an important percentage, and that's something that we've been watching closely over the years. In fact, this is one of the arguments for continuing the long-term monitoring of the population, is to see whether or not over time, as successive generations of coyotes are being raised close to people, are we seeing any general trends toward coyotes losing their fear of people and then eventually becoming aggressive? So far, we have not seen that pattern. So this is an image that is in the book as well, and it does, I like it as a emblem of one of our sources of conflict between coyotes and people are their threats to dogs. And it does occasionally happen. Fortunately, it's very rare. It's extremely rare when you consider that their natural instinct is to remove the competing dog-like animal from their territories. So in a natural setting, if, for example, coyotes happen to see a fox in their territory, they will often chase it and even kill it. Wolves do the same thing to coyotes in their territories. That's the rule in the canid world, is the big dog removes the smaller dog. But fortunately, day in and day out, most of the coyotes, the vast majority of them, resist that instinct, and they actually don't attack dogs. In fact, many of them do as much as they can to avoid dogs if they can. It can change, that relationship can change for two reasons. One is during the litter rearing season. Again, if they feel threatened, if they think the dog is threatening their litter or they're too close to their den, they can become dog aggressive. Or if they're used to seeing, if they're losing their fear of people, because it's their fear of people that's keeping them from, I guess, exercising their instincts. And so when they lose their fear of people, which is often preceded by feeding, then that there's kind of this slippery slope that eventually ends up dogs getting bitten by coyotes. So one of the most important things that we found, and every other study across other cities are finding the same thing, which is most of the conflicts are preceded by some level of feeding. It's kind of sounds like a broken record. It sounds a little too simplistic, but that is the truth. That's typically what we find. So again, in our case, in our population, over 95% of the coyotes don't even generate a comment by people. They don't even know they're there. The small percentage that do, almost all of them are getting some degree of feeding from people, either intentionally or unintentionally. So we do have people that will continue to feed wildlife, and especially they'll feed coyotes for a wide range of reasons. But there's many other people, a larger segment of the public, that are probably unintentionally providing food for coyotes, either through garbage management or lack of management, feeding pets outside, or leaving pet food out at night, as you saw in one of the videos. And we even find unique situations such as people, certain cultures, perhaps leaving food in cemeteries, and our coyotes taking advantage of that. So those are some of the conflicts. A lot of people ask me this question: why should we put up with coyotes in cities at all? I mean, what good are they? And so fortunately, we have been able to explore some of these questions, like what are they doing in cities? Are they performing any kind of ecological services, or are they just eating our garbage? And so I mentioned that many of these animals are actually eating very little of our foods. So what are they doing? So they are making their presence felt as a predator, and that's actually a good thing in most cases. So one of the things that we discovered purely through accident, that I don't have time to go into, we found that they are responsible for taking almost half of all Canada goose nests in the Chicago metro area. So I don't think you have to deal with Canada geese in San Francisco, but I'm sure you have other waterfowl or other birds that are not that are supposed to be migratory that don't migrate, and can become a nuisance in and of themselves. And so what we found, again, this is um, um, early research that we did, and we found that they are the only effective predator on goose nests. Geese actually are very good at deterring predators, excluding them from their nests, except for coyotes. And so, again, without explaining all of this, what we found is that natural areas is where most of the geese were trying to nest, and that's where the highest predation rates were. And so they were actually, the coyotes were having this impact such that they were able to actually lower the growth rate of the goose population in Chicago. Another way that they exert their effects is something else that we've been studying, such as deer survival. So especially fawns. And the big question was, in an urban setting with really high deer densities and coyote densities, do they even have a role? Do they even make an impact as far as fawn survival? And what we found through the last 7 years we've been doing this work, is extremely difficult. So this is a few of the technicians catching a fawn within a few either hours or a day or two after birth, and putting quickly within 2 minutes. That's our goal, is to find the fawn. We put an expandable radio collar around that animal, and then we release it to its mother to document its survival. And what we found is that coyotes are a major predator on these fawns, and it will vary some from year to year, but the fawn predation rate can be anywhere from 33%, that's in a low year, or it could be as high as 80% in a high year. So 80% of the fawns being taken by coyotes, and coyotes are the only real cause of mortality for deer at any stage of their life. They do eventually get hit by cars, but it's rare. And the coyote predation is incredibly important to helping to slow the deer population growth. And it turns out, in terms of if you want to talk about risk to people, the health and safety of people, it's actually deer or ungulates are more dangerous to people than coyotes are through deer auto collisions. So each time they take a fawn, they're potentially actually saving someone's life or health. And then where we haven't done as much work as we should is through their predation on rodents. But we do know that they're taking a lot of rodents out there. And this is also performing a service because rodents cause their own conflicts with people to a certain degree. So this is the stomach content of one coyote. In this case, you're looking at almost 10 rodents taken from that stomach of that animal that was hit by a car. Our record is this. I'm sorry for this kind of gross slide, but there's actually at least 23 voles taken from a stomach. This is just the stomach of the animal. That's not even its full digestive tract. But that gives me an idea of how much rodent hunting they do, even in the urban settings. I'm going to skip this. And the last thing is feral cats, or outdoor cats. So we did a large scale study on outdoor cats, and we found these are cats that I maintained. I had my own colonies, experimental colonies, so they're all radio collared. So we could look at their movements and where they went in relation to coyotes, and also how many cats were taken by coyotes. And what we found was surprising, which was these outdoor cats, these are unowned, very feral cats. They were very good at figuring out where coyotes live, and they avoided coyotes. And what that meant was that coyotes were effectively creating their own kind of security blanket over green spaces or areas where cats normally might be going into and causing their own predation effects, but the coyotes prevented them from doing that. Now, this is also, I point this out because it turns out that increasingly some of the LA work, the Los Angeles work, has been showing that this is one difference between LA and Chicago, and that cats actually make up a large part of the coyote diet in Los Angeles. And why that is, there's different hypotheses for that. It may be because there's more cats, more free-ranging cats in LA, or not. We don't know. Or it could be that the coyotes are acting differently, but that is a significant difference between LA and many other cities in addition to Chicago. And then the very last thing is the personalities I mentioned. This is what we've just been working on most recently. This is our attempt to document boldness and also linking it to certain genetic markers to see whether or not there's a genetic basis to boldness in our coyotes. So one of the many tests, and I don't have time to go through all the different tests that we've put our coyotes through, but novel objects is one of the things that we did. So we would place one of these objects in the territory of our radio-collared animals. So the ring toy, or my favorite was the yard gnome. And so here's an example of a yard gnome being approached by one of our coyotes. And so we would document their behavior and how they would respond to these novel objects. And it wasn't just coyotes that were responding to novel objects in strange ways. People actually were fascinated with yard gnomes, including taking pictures of yard gnomes. And here's one of our coyotes approaching a yard gnome. So that's a fairly bold behavior. And then it would actually mark it, which is the most bold behavior a coyote can do to the poor yard gnome. What we found from this research, and this is preliminary, is that there's definitely a trend toward coyotes exhibiting more bold behavior in the city or in the most urban parts of the metro area. And then it's less common out in the suburbs or the natural areas. So there is at least this suggestion that boldness may be a positive, I guess, behavior for these animals. The question is whether or not that eventually becomes aggressive or not. So boldness does not mean necessarily that the animal is going to become aggressive. You can actually have shy animals become aggressive, um, as well as bold animals, or you can have bold animals that never become aggressive. So there's still another step to be taken, but the boldness is interesting, and it turns out we just participated in a multi-city um, collaborative project to compare responses to novel objects in different cities. And what, again, was the consistent trend across cities was the same pattern, which is that boldness increased in urban areas. And I don't know if you can see this. This is just a color video of one of our urban packs. That's on the railway on the south side of Chicago. So that's a pack of 5 coyotes. And you can just see the different responses that the animals had to the ring toy that's within a pack. And so those are the things we attempted to measure. So that's all I'm going to try and cover with you. I'm sorry that it's been a long story, but I try to share as many stories as I can. Any project of this size is only possible through the work and effort of many people, and so I forget how many technicians we've had working on this project. We every time we tabulate it, it's outdated. But Shane McKenzie was has been one of our main technicians, in addition to the funding agencies that have funded the project. And very lastly, this is, I guess, an ego slide, but it's not really an ego slide. So those are pictures of me during different years of this study. And this was actually a sad byproduct of doing a book, because the publishers needed pictures from the project. And this is the only time I actually sat down and started looking at images that were taken years ago. And you don't realize how much you age until you actually put a picture of yourself at different years side by side. And it's an indication of, I mean, it's nice to be able to conduct a project for this long, but it can also be kind of humbling when you see just how much you changed during that time. So with that, I can, I guess, take any questions if we want to try and do that. I'll turn it back over to Charlie if you want.
Yeah, sure. If folks want to type in their questions to the Q&A box, they can do that, or the chat as well. It looks like we have one question from Jane asks, since both males and females are very protective of their young, how do you get the kits out of the den to test them?
Oh, yeah, good question. So they are very protective of their den with regard to other animals, but not so much with people. So we're able to go into the dens without any real conflicts or any kind of challenges by them. There's been a few cases where an animal, especially, it turns out coyote number one, the very first one, that female, she actually would try to stand us off. She would bark and stamp her feet, but that was the most aggressive they ever got with us approaching their den. So it's generally when a dog approaches the den that we run into problems.
Um, L asks if there are any recorded incidents of coyote attacks on people.
Yeah, so we published a paper on coyote attacks on people. So yes, it does happen. It's rare, as you might imagine. So there have been 2 fatal attacks. One was a young 3-year-old girl. This was back in 1981, and that was in Los Angeles, or at least one of I think Glendale, so a suburb of LA. So 1981 is when that happened. And then in 2009, there was a 19-year-old woman that was hiking by herself. This is on Cape Breton Island off of the coast of Nova Scotia. So not an urban setting whatsoever. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It was a very rural, very remote area. And she was definitely attacked by a group of coyotes and eventually died from the wounds from that attack. But those are the only two cases that have been documented that have resulted in fatalities. Now, in terms of injuries, the majority have been fortunately very minor. Even some of the children, it's been mostly minor. Hopefully it'll stay that way. So we documented over a 40-year period in our publication, over a 40-year period, about 140 cases of incidents of a coyote biting someone. So that was our definition of an attack. But many of those cases, it was not a predatory thing. It was either defensive, or it was someone trying to protect their pet, and they ended up getting bit either by the coyote or perhaps by the dog. Or a strange thing over in California, especially over in Los Angeles, we found that there's a high percentage of what would be classified as an attack was actually coyotes investigating someone. So when what that means is that in many cases, these are people that are actually laying on the ground, sleeping on the ground at night, and they're startled. They wake up and there's a coyote nibbling on their arm or their leg, and when they jump up, they scare the coyote away. So it wasn't predation, and the coyote wasn't being aggressive. They were simply trying to find out whether or not that's something they should eat. So a large part of those 140 cases over 40 years over the span of the US and Canada was investigative and not predatory. But it kind of gives you an idea of what the relative risk is. So there is a risk, but it's pretty low. And I should say, with the exception of the Cape Breton case and a handful of other cases, almost all of the bites have taken place as a result of, again, people feeding them. Even the fatality, the young girl in LA, that was due to a community feeding coyotes. And this is, again, was back in 1981. This is before anyone really thought that coyotes would be any kind of a threat. And so they didn't see the harm in feeding these animals. And you really can't blame them because no one knew better. So feeding has led to a few of those, well, the majority of those incidents.
Okay, I have a question here from Sheila. How do you walk your dog if a coyote lives in your neighborhood and is visible weekly? What can we do to protect our dog?
Yeah, so if it's a small dog, then, well, first of all, whether it's small or large, hopefully it's on a leash. So I'm assuming you're talking about a leashed animal. If it's a small dog, then the best thing you can do is pick it up if you happen to encounter the coyote, and pick up the animal and yell at the coyote, back away, and it should leave the animal alone. If it's a larger dog, then again, you want to keep the dog closer to you, and you want to act big and loud toward the coyote and keep the coyote scared. And you can also do things such as, I don't know if carrying mace or pepper spray or something is something that's useful if people do that much when you're taking walks, but that can be helpful at times. And that could be useful when you have a coyote if you can't keep it away from your dog.
All right. If anyone else has any more questions, we have a couple more minutes here. If you have a question you'd like our expert to answer. Okay, another one. Let's see. A little more on the attacks on humans that have been recorded, does that mean that the surprise accidents disproportionately affect people who are homeless or on beaches?
I don't know because we weren't always able to get information about the victims for those cases, unfortunately. So we were just doing a meta-analysis of documented cases, again, going back to the late 1960s or early 1970s. So it wasn't always documented what the situation was with the person. I do know that of the few cases that I was familiar with, um, occasionally you would have a homeless case, but in some cases you did not. In fact, there's some famous cases where, for example, one of the cases involved a homeowner who had a hot tub in his backyard, and he fell asleep in his hot tub with his head hanging over the edge of the hot tub, and a coyote came by. This is again late at night, and nipped the top of his head, and scaring both him and the coyote when he jumped and screamed. So that's a case. And there's a very famous case of a coyote. Um, it was over in Arizona over the span of a week. For some reason that no one understands, this coyote um, lost its fear of people each evening during that week. It would jump over the fence to get into someone's yard where there was usually a group of people socializing, like a barbecue or that type of thing. So the noise somehow they believe, attracted the animal. In each case, the yard was fenced in. It would jump over the fence into the yard where the people were located. It would find someone who was sitting down. It would nip them in the right buttock and then jump back over the fence. So it didn't actually cause any real injuries to speak of, but scared people. And it did that each night for a week until eventually nuisance professionals were contracted to lethally remove it, and they did do that. So you end up with some strange situations like that that are inexplicable.
Okay, I have another question here on, do coyotes carry ticks?
Yeah, they do carry ticks. When they're healthy, it's rare. You don't usually see them carrying a really high tick burden. And that's because they do groom each other. So they do when they're resting often, especially the alpha animals, they will lick each other and they will nibble, and they will occasionally remove some of the ticks. And so you don't see the same kind of tick burden on the pack animals that you might see on the transients, but they can carry ticks. And disease is something I didn't talk about very much here, and yet that's one of the main reasons for the we get funding for the project. I can tell you that I think I mentioned it earlier. In general, our coyotes are very healthy, and that's at least partly due. I mean, the reason why the tick burden is low is the grooming, but also their physical condition is excellent, which also helps them repel or resist some of the parasites.
Okay, awesome. I think we have maybe time for one last question, which is, um, it's interesting to see the big impact the coyotes had on the geese. Do we know how much coyotes control cat population, or how much the coyotes controlling cat populations also impacts bird populations?
Right. So what we know, so there was actually a great study done in California. I believe this was over in the San Diego area by Kevin Crooks, and it's a seminal paper. This was done in the 1990s, and they were not monitoring the coyote population per se, but they were documenting in different parks the presence of cats and coyotes and nest success of the songbirds in those areas. And what they found was a very strong relationship where you had coyotes occurring in those parks, you did not have cats, and you had a higher nest success. Where you did not have coyotes occurring, you did have cats, and you had much lower nest success. And that was the first really kind of comprehensive study to document this idea about trophic cascades, or what they were calling a mesopredator release. So they hypothesized that it was coyotes were the reason why the cats were not occurring in those areas where they were there. And therefore, coyotes were actually increasing nest success of birds. And other studies have found similar results since that early study.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and expertise, Dr. Stan. That was awesome.
Sure. Hopefully, I didn't bore people too much. I tried to keep to the time frame a little bit, but hopefully they found it enjoyable.
I think it was great. And we have it recorded so folks can share it.
Great.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. We have a couple links in chat. You can check out The Coyotes Among Us. You can check out some other books that are like shelf friends to that book. Look at the research that the Urban Coyote Research Project is doing. Maybe go to some more events or webinars that the library provides. And yeah, stay cool if you're in San Francisco. Have a good night elsewhere.
Yep. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Have a good one. Bye-bye.